Topaz has been a staple in any team composition centered around follow-up attacks since her debut in patch 1.4, and with her receiving various new best and slot allies in the following patches, it's no surprise that she has proven her worth in the current era of the Honkai style meta game. Despite being one of the better characters to have in the current meta, Topaz didn't always hold her current position. In fact, she was way less valued than some of the characters that have fell off by today's standards. In today's video, we're going to take a look at Honkai Star Rail's most redeeming character. If you played Honkai Star Rail pre 2.0, you pretty much know that the meta game was dominated by hyper carry. If you want to be logical, you could argue that is sort of the case nowadays. The only difference is that it is now manifested into nuanced playstyles. Hypercarry dominated since the release of the game, and it was thanks to the mass amount of single target buffers the game could offer. There were a few exceptions, such as Asta, who could be slotted in different teams due to her team-wide buffs. So she wasn't restricted to just hypercarry. Her kit strength wasn't enough to however shape the meta or change the direction of the meta, and honestly she would reinforce it further. We at least knew that team-wide buffers were a thing. The prototype would signal that having more than a singular damage dealer in the team would mean that the buffs given by a team-wide offensive buffer would be utilized even better. But for the time being, that was only utilized by Kafka dot teams. Honkai Star Rail was capable of making quirky playstyles that weren't just going to reinforce the ongoing hypercarry meta. And it wasn't until the second half of patch 1.4 with the release of Topaz where we could take a guess at what the metagame's direction was going. Topaz releasing after the simultaneous overtuned AoE eccentric damage dealers in a meta centered around AoE burst damage meant that her single target damage was not given any benefit of the doubt. Topaz was slandered, mocked, and regarded as one of the worst limited characters the game has ever released at the time of her arrival. So by yours truly, of course. I still stand by Topaz having the worst launch out of any limited character to this date, and it was because her immediate value didn't match the current meta game. It was like Hoyoverse sold the solution and would create the problem later, which is funnily enough exactly what they did. What gave Topaz the worst limited release out of any character the game had seen, you ask? Well, for one, Topaz had trouble keeping up with the very strong hypercarry centric damage dealers. Obviously, she's not meant to, and we'll get to that point. You just have to understand that first impressions are important to the average player, and those same impressions for Topaz weren't that great. Her kit would buff follow-up attack damage a singular enemy would receive, and the same kit was at a time where the follow-up attacks that could benefit from the damage increase were limited in terms of characters. Topaz would lastly have backloaded damage much like the Lightning Lord of Jing Yuan, which meant that her overall damage was spread across the turn order. This just didn't compare to the hypercarry damage dealers that could dish out their damage and get an additional turn from an offensive buffer right after for even more damage. However, Topaz's teammates weren't the same as those of the hypercarry damage dealers, as she buffed follow-up attack damage additionally while dishing out her own damage, benefiting from another damage dealer greatly. This is where the best teammates of Topaz for the time being were only two that fell out of the meta during this point in time. One last team that could work using Topaz was with Asta and Himiko, but it heavily depended on the enemy being weak to fire. Topaz didn't utilize the best offensive buffing supports in the game either, as she was known to be a sub-damage dealer, and one that didn't want to burn any skill points if she could help it. She needed a specific Harmony character that could buff the whole team much like Asta, and another damage dealer that could function by her side as the main damage dealer. She was the solution of the problems we didn't have at this point in Honkai Star Rail for this unique archetype. Topaz also didn't have an optimal relic set at the time of her arrival, and for her to become a best in slot buffer for the current existing characters, she needed both her light cone and first Eidolon for the massive damage increase she would give to the team, making her function more optimally in the team at her role over the already established buffers. This Eidolon and light cone bait would matter much more when we talk about Doctor Ratio in the later patches, but for the time being, Topaz in 1.4 would be regarded as a skip, and for me personally, the worst limited release of any character. It was truly just that bad. Topaz will begin to see better days with the release of patch 1.5 and the brand new Ash Blazing Duke relic set that was to give follow-up attackers a massive attack and follow-up attack damage boost for being a part of that archetype. Topaz and Jing was to both benefit immensely from this new set, and considering both dealt damage in a team comp alongside one another contributing to the overall team damage, it would net a massive damage increase as compared to being a buff for only one of the two. Obviously, those that played around this time period had intel on this relic set releasing in the coming patch, and thanks to the 1.5 special program, even the average player got a hold of this information to decide what they would do during the remaining days of Topaz's banner. It was still going to take a lot to change the perception centered around Topaz, one that would make the player feel the FOMO centered around this character as they awaited her rerun, because the average player had no reason to roll for the character. Ruan Mei's release in the first half of 1.6 did showcase that having another character in the form of a team-wide buffer worked for the quirkier teams. Topaz still needed that damage-dealing ally that could benefit from her follow-up attack boost, and it wouldn't be until the second half of the same patch that Dr. Ratio could fulfill that role, having a damage dealer centered around the follow-up attacks while also being strong enough to give a better show of strength when it comes to other paths will be exactly what Dr. Ratio needed to be. And for Topaz specifically, he did deliver, with one caveat which I'll explain a little later. For Topaz's team alongside Ruan Mei, you would essentially have the start of what was a follow-up attack or dual damage dealer setup. This team comp would do damage out of turn in different parts of the action order, contributing to the overall team damage, which wasn't a new concept as dot damage over time showcased that. It at least meant that the different team comp archetypes would be unique to that of the traditional hypercarry setup. It also meant that the new archetypes could be kind of expensive to get going for the average player. The Topaz and Dr. Ratio team would become the most extreme example of that. Let me explain. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Topaz will require having her first Eidolon and Light Cone to feel like an adequate replacement in some hypercarry teams, which is whatever. In the case of Dr. Ratio's team, she needed one of those premium options to function. Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack isn't guaranteed, unless the enemy he's attacking has multiple debuffs, of course not accounting for his ultimate, which is guaranteed follow-up attacks. Not to say you couldn't land a follow-up attack onto the enemy that didn't have multiple debuffs, it was just gated behind RNG. This would mean that not having Topaz with her first Eidolon or Light Cone would cause Dr. Ratio to have a DPS loss if failing to land the follow-up attack, which made characters like Soulwolf and Pela more valued. Topaz at E0S0, despite being a character made to synergize with Dr. Ratio, was unable to do so. During this point in time, the situation was deemed to be completely scummy from Hoyoverse. Nowadays, this seems like a non-issue, but it was most definitely a you had to be there moment. Fast forward to the later iterations of Honkai Star with the release of Sparkle, whom actually gave longer lasting offensive buffs with action additional forwarding matching that of Bronya, making her an amazing buffer for characters with follow-up attacks. Your summons got additional crit damage for the turn, which would increase the crit damage ceiling drastically. Ruan Mei was still prominent and a staple for the dual DPS teams, but at the very least, we knew that there was going to be a shift in the coming patches for the meta game. The writing was on the wall that the follow-up archetype had some work to be done, and the release of Aventurine in patch 2.1 proved this to be even more true. Aventurine was a colleague of Topaz. Having a direct lore connection would mean that they could function in similar scenarios regarding team comps, and that was also proven to be true. Aventurine was the premier follow-up archetype defensive option that was a very strong pairing for Dr. Ratio and Topaz. Dr. Ratio especially. Aventurine gave shields that would refresh with his passive, and that same passive would stack with follow-up attacks allies would dish out, meaning a team with Topaz and Dr. Ratio consistently doing follow-up attacks would ensure that the team never takes any damage. How could this team function without Topaz giving Dr. Ratio enough debuffs on the targets he attacked? Well, Aventurine gave an additional debuff with his ultimate that boosted the critical damage the enemy would take. Aventurine will also benefit from the follow-up attack damage boost provided by Topaz and would also boost the action forward of Topaz's Numbi, giving her more damage. So Aventurine not only contributed to the overall team damage, but also the economy of the team too. Having a debuff on an ultimate would ensure that Dr. Ratio could consistently dish out follow-up attacks on enemies with an E0S0 Topaz on his team. At this point in time, Topaz's team alongside Dr. Ratio and Aventurine would begin to dominate the meta, as the team-wide oriented damage was becoming competitive to the hypercarry team composition. The emerging follow-up archetype's position in the meta would be reinforced with that of Robin in the second half of 2.2. Robin was the last missing puzzle piece to the follow-up attack team composition, as she was to immediately replace Ruan Mei in the Topaz, Ratio, and Aventurine team. The abbreviation for this team would become FART, with Fei Zhao later, but for now we can just call it Dart. The Dart team would benefit immensely from Robin as she gave buffs dependent on her own turns, boosting all the damage of the team regardless of turn orders, and she was to give further offensive damage buffs to follow-up attack characters, giving her more staying power in this specific team composition. The Dart team would then go on to dominate the meta, becoming one of the best teams in the game thanks to the synergy every character had with each other. You also need to take into consideration that this team required 4 limited characters, one of those being given for free. It was still an expensive team nonetheless, but at the very least you no longer need a Topaz's Eidolon or the signature light cone during this point in time. Topaz and Dr. Ratio would see even more buffs with the following release of the Izumo Gensai planar set during this point in time, with the fact that both characters alongside one another would fulfill the requirement of the passive needed for the free crit stats given to the wearer. The critical rate would help boost Topaz and Dr. Ratio's damage, giving more consistency in that regard. The Dart team, while seemingly expensive to obtain, but also to build due to crit scaling damage dealers in a meta where characters don't need any crit at all, would still be in line as one of the 2 top teams in the current meta game. The other team would be a lot more free-to-play friendly as mentioned before. As time went on, the notions around Topaz would begin to shift, but for the average player, they were either enjoying the broken AoE damage dealer that catered to the hypercarry crowd, or the very easy to build team that was also very auto-friendly. The average player didn't have the resources nor wanted to invest multiple of those resources into a character they probably already skipped. Their current 2 teams were already established, and it didn't help that those 2 teams were centered around the 2 popular characters at the time. Funnily enough, some people even rolled for Aventurine to use him alongside Acheron because of the debuff and critical damage increase he gave. You most definitely didn't need a character like Topaz. As the patches continued on and the Dart team began to hit a ceiling, the newest planar set Duran Dynasty of Wolves would drop with the follow-up attack users in mind. This set would be a slight upgrade over the Izumo set for the Dart team specifically, but it wouldn't be worth changing your rugs for once more to obtain unless you were the most egregious example of a relic grinder. I would honestly hate to have that title personally. Relic farming in this game still sucks. For the Dart characters, the Dynasty planar set would give more follow-up attack damage, which was very valuable for Topaz and Dr. Ratio. The last part of the passive would give critical damage to the wearer of the planar set once the criteria was stacked up. It gave a measly 0.5% increase in critical value than that of the previous Izumo planar set, but the most valued thing was that the follow-up attack boost as the damage attack percentage Robin gave and the attack percentage from the Ash Blazing Duke set Topaz equipped gave her a very nice amount of additional attack. You just had to be the judge of whether or not this was worth farming for your individual account. March 7th, the Hunt would wound up being a solid replacement for Dr. Ratio in the follow-up attack team alongside Topaz. While being a weaker version of Dr. Ratio in the same team comp, she's still given to the player for free at any point in the player's future endeavors, while Dr. Ratio is no longer being given to the player for free. Her role definitely makes a lot of sense. There's really not much else to say regarding this character in Moe's. I quite literally didn't have this character built, but from what I can see, he's a replacement for Topaz as a 4-star character, which gives him additional selling power. I never planned on building this character personally, as I already have Topaz built since her introduction in 1.4, but thought this was worth mentioning in the video at least. The closest comparison I can give to Moe's is Moe's to Topaz being the Gallagher to Lingsha, a nice 4-star alternative that still keeps the team archetype flowing in the way it should. This honestly lessens the value of Topaz as a standalone E0 character, so it's no surprise that less players would want to roll for a future Topaz when there's an arguably cheaper version that isn't tied to being limited. This is good, by the way. The Dart team would then become the fart team it is known as today. The release of Fei Zhao in patch 2.5 has given the Topaz follow-up attack team an even stronger addition of a damage dealer with no need for RNG on the follow-up attacks dish from this character. I cannot express how huge that is. Fei Zhao gives an overwhelming amount of additional damage to the overall team damage from the out-of-turn damage with her consistent follow-up attacks and her own ultimate damage. Fei Zhao at her release would be deemed to be the best damage dealer in the game, as she had no caveats while still dishing out insane amount of damage. It also worked in her favor that as a crit-based damage dealer, she could abuse the kit to the full extent of characters such as Robin and Aventurine. giving her a cozy spot in the best team at the time. This now overbearing team would have a new endgame to give it even more of a presence in the meta, Apocalyptic Shadow. This new endgame was centered around bosses and breaking the bosses by destroying the toughness bars of the surrounding enemies. Needing many attacks that could break the toughness quickly is what would allow the follow-up attack team to excel in this new game mode. It also did help with the addition of the weakness types present too. Let's not lastly forget that the bosses take massive damage from the sheer single target damage of the team comp that is unmatched by any other team comp in the game. This would then lead us to present day star rail for Topaz and her follow-up attack team. Has the perception of Topaz changed since her introduction in patch 1.4? Yes, but it was with the help of the broken characters that the individual characters of the archetype ended up being. Aventurine is an amazing defensive option that has an overwhelming popularity amongst the general player base. Robin is the go-to character for nearly every team in the game, and for the meta player, she's a must-have because of her insane team-wide turn cycling. Fei Zhao is just an overtuned damage dealer that when paired with Topaz gives even more of a boost to the overall team damage. It's just unfair. It took making busted characters that fit in an archetype alongside Topaz in a meta that heavily favors follow-up attackers being pushed by Hoyoverse. Yet people still won't pull for Topaz. It's kinda insane when you think about it. That's it. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.